Hello, this is Luke Bajarski, Research Director at Skift, coming to you live from Skift Studios in New York City to bring you the next episode of Skift Special Subscriber Screencast Analyst Sessions for subscribers only. So this is a very special day. We have a very full house from our team here, ready to debate the current state and potential future of the vacation rental industry. So we're gonna be talking a lot about what's happening in the space. There's so much buzz about Airbnb, Brian Chesky, experiences. Everyone is talking about what's happening with that company, but what many people don't realize is that there's a lot going on in the space that goes beyond Airbnb. So in our most recent research report, we entitled "The State of the Global Vacation Market," we identified what we call 3 waves of consolidation, or the lack thereof, now taking place in the vacation rental tech space. So today we have an all-star cast here, a crew of senior analysts and editors from our team. We have Jared Ween, senior research analyst, Dave Montali, dialing in from our Berlin office. We have Deanna Ting, who's our senior hospitality editor, and also Sean O'Neill, who's our travel tech editor, ready to talk about all the issues that are impacting the market. So thanks for joining us, guys.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, same.
Fantastic. So I guess, let's start with the basics a little bit, because there's just so much talk about vacation rentals these days. People are calling it a gold rush. They're calling it, everything, there's huge hype around what's happening, but ultimately there's a big distinction between the different types of home and apartment rentals that are out on the market these days. Everybody's freaking out about Airbnb and the threat to those traditional hotels. Deanna, what do you think? Just in terms of the types of inventory out there, what are you seeing?
Yeah. So, if you talk to most major hotel companies, they'll say, Airbnb, not really a threat. We're fine. We're doing fine. It's not a problem. They often say that Airbnb is sort of like the type of person who uses Airbnb. They're using it for very specific reasons, or they're staying longer, or they're using it for vacation rental type properties. And that's true in some cases. Airbnb really touts its strength in certain areas. But surprisingly, and I think a lot of people don't know this, it's like Airbnb isn't necessarily the leader in vacation rentals at this moment. Maybe they're the leader in terms of the number of short-term rental listings worldwide, but they're not always necessarily thought of as the go-to platform for vacation rentals. You've got other big players like VRBO, HomeAway. And the fact is that vacation rentals have been around for a really long time, even longer than Airbnb itself. So yeah, it's different. I think it's interesting because some hotel companies are actively very engaged in this space. Like Wyndham, for instance, has a really huge global network of vacation rentals all around the world. But as of late, in the past few months, there's been an intense amount of interest in vacation rentals from the hospitality side, primarily because of Airbnb's acquisition of luxury retreats, and then also Accor announcing its intent to buy Travel Keys.
There's a lot of interesting stuff that we'll talk about there in a little bit. So I guess the question is whether or not it's an apples to apples comparison, right?
Yeah, it's hard to say. And the problem is, one report will come out and then another report will come out, and every report says something, different, more or less. And I know that in my, my experiences with covering Airbnb, it's really hard to always know or to trust the source material or the data that's being released. An STR report came out a couple months ago that used actual Airbnb data. And it basically said, hotels, don't worry about it, guys. We're fine. We're doing great. If there's softness in certain markets, it's only because there's increased supply. So, Airbnb is cool. And, Airbnb gave us this data. So trust us, it's all legit. Right. But, there have been instances widely reported where Airbnb has sort of, in some ways presented data that may not necessarily be the accurate or full representation of data that really exists. And then another report came out like from Morgan Stanley that said like, no, Airbnb is like a major threat. Like, be scared, hotels. Like, they're coming for you.
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah, some of the issues that we definitely had in a couple of the reports that we've done to understand what the market looks like from an inventory perspective and bookings perspective is, impacted by the fact that there's so many different types of property rentals out there. You have the obviously the professionally managed second homes, which are the vacation rentals, which are what we'll be talking about today. But then Airbnb with this kind of, let's say, do-it-yourself or kind of weekend warrior urban renter, more focused on the urban environment, right? It's so difficult to understand, what that market actually looks like. I think we're getting close, and we're definitely on top of that. But just in terms of the landscape, it's very interesting what we're seeing. And obviously Airbnb kind of came on as this sharing economy model. Following the likes of what was that couchsurfing.com kind of platform, right? With the the sharing economy and all that stuff. But as we'll talk about here in a little bit, how Airbnb is also moving into a different direction in terms of luxury and etc. Okay, well, so we're talking about the inventory landscape. And here specifically, when we're talking about vacation rentals, some of the figures that we've come up with, that we've talked to from the executives from various groups, kind of look at the European and the U.S. market as around, in terms of properties, in terms of total inventory, at between 5 to 6 million professionally managed properties across the U.S. and Europe, which sounds like a lot, but let's think about that in the broader landscape in terms of the supply and how fragmented it is, and the management companies that are involved here. Dave, what do you think about this figure here? We have, there's a lot going on here. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really interesting. Even if you compare it to Airbnb, Airbnb claims they have 3 million listings worldwide. So 5.6 does seem quite extensive, but I also think it's professionally managed, and the majority is still within smaller companies which manage from 10 to 20 properties. So it's really spread out. It's not that they're all on one platform or managed by one large company. Even Wyndham Vacation Rental, which is the kind of the largest professional manager property management company, they have roughly 100,000 properties, just slightly more. So I think it's a pretty big market, and companies are trying to kind of get a larger share of it and take over the small individual who's currently owning the business in a way.
So when we talk about individual groups, I mean, Wyndham is the big standout, 112,000 properties. Yep. But still, if you think about the 5.6 million that are potentially out there just in the US and Europe alone, what's going on with all the other, the rental spaces, professionally managed rentals? Who's managing them? Who's, where they market those properties is a different story. But in terms of the, fragmented supply and who owns that supply from a management perspective is very much still up in the air.
Absolutely. Like Deanna mentioned, vacation rentals is way older than Airbnb and the sharing economy. So I think a lot of properties are still in that traditional management space where, for example, on Sylt, an island in Germany, you'll have 5 companies who do property management, and they each have 30 homes, and it's always run like that. And I think it's still working like that. I think the transition is slowly starting with these large companies aggregating more inventory, but it seems like the supply is absolutely still owned by the smaller companies.
Right. And we're talking about smaller companies, so we're talking about like the mom and pop kind of property rental management group working out of, let's say, Orlando or something, right? That has 10
Absolutely.
or 15 properties under management, but then they'll run that space for the owner and use different platforms to promote those places, so different marketplaces, right?
No, absolutely. And I mean, even if you look at Vacasa, for example, I think they're the second largest property management company, and they're actively acquiring these smaller companies, so it really goes to show that the small companies still have all of the inventory.
Right. Exactly. And we'll look at a list of the more recent acquisitions that Vacasa has gone through a little bit later in the show here. But marketplaces, obviously, so we need to distinguish between the vacation rental property management groups and the marketplaces. Some kind of function as both. Vacasa, for example, has that consumer touch point, has that website where you can actually go and rent a Vacasa property, but the majority of their rooms get filled via these big marketplaces, right? The HomeAways, the Booking.coms, TripAdvisor, and more recently, Airbnb as they move into the luxury retreat space. Deanna, I know you covered some of that when luxury retreats was acquired. What do you think of that move there?
Oh yeah, no, I think it's a really smart move on their part. Not to say that before acquiring luxury retreats that you couldn't stay in those types of properties before, like those nice mansions that Airbnb likes to give to the Kardashians and whatnot. But now that they have luxury retreats, it definitely ups their game in terms of providing really kind of curated, very high touch, high service types of experiences for people who want to have a private home or retreat to stay in. I think it's a smart move. There's higher margins for those types of properties. And it's also been rumored that Airbnb is planning to launch a very specific luxury product. Retreats would be a perfect fit for that.
So what do you guys think? Is luxury retreats just going to get sucked into the Airbnb brand, all that inventory? Or are they just going to, just absorb all that inventory? Are they going to keep that luxury retreats name? And anybody's guess, right?
Anybody's guess. I know that they are sort of like they've said that the luxury retreats team is remaining in place. They'll handle their operations out of Montreal, I believe, where they're based. So it does seem like Airbnb will sort of like retain that talent at least. But I think it makes sense for them to sort of like try to pull in that inventory into Airbnb. But it seems like they'll probably kind of separate it more into like that Airbnb Luxe product that they eventually want to launch.
Right. So we're talking about Airbnb and how they're moving into this luxury vacation rental space. And a lot of the stuff when we talk to some of the property management groups, they weren't too keen on the way that Airbnb kind of organizes its technology, its ability to leverage the Airbnb tech for multiple properties. I don't know, Sean, what you've heard from some of the people you've been talking to about Airbnb's ability to really ramp up the big hotels or even like the bigger vacation rental groups.
Yeah, it's been striking as to follow up on what Deanna has said. Skift has reported this before. It was only in 2016 that Airbnb started going around to conference events and saying, hey, LiveRes, hey, Red Awning, hey, B2B vendor tools, we want to work with you and want to retrofit things better. Michael Endelman had been in the Skift offices sort of talking on this issue. So they've been slow. They very much have wanted to focus on the short-term rental and really nail that down prior to potential IPO. I think in terms of the marketplaces overall, the context definitely in the past few years has been, the game has been whoever has the most beds wins. And now in the next few years, we're moving to this, who is best at putting heads into those beds. And that's both a B2C issue, as Jared talked about, and Dennis on the last analyst call and talking about Google and all the platforms, how do you convert customers? But there's also the B2B challenge, which is what Deanna was referring to, is like trying to get the inventory and content up on. And I think Airbnb is sort of struggling with that so far.
That's really interesting. And, in terms of instant bookable properties too, I know that's a big push that the market is going for, and Booking.com has always been a kind of a a cheerleader for instant bookable properties. They haven't really wavered on that front at all. And I know that just from personal experience as a former Airbnb superhost, I don't know if I'm supposed to actually say that, but I was for a little while renting my apartment before it got too big. But anyway, I've noticed that lately that they're definitely pushing for more instant bookable properties with their inventory.
Very much so, yeah. And I mean, it's easier for them, but it's also that was also tied into sort of like the bias and discrimination challenges that Airbnb was kind of called out on last year. So that was sort of like a motivating force for them to really like up the number of instant bookable properties that they have.
But was it from a tech perspective though, in terms of the challenges of filling those beds? Is that instant bookable? Is that kind of a key to that puzzle, just in terms of aligning that tech?
It is. I mean, part of the problem is that as it gets glossed on in the report, is that of all of the professionally managed properties, not the self-managed ones, of those, about a third of them have high-tech property management systems that can do the instant bookability and a lot of latest features. They have the APIs that allow that. 2/3 of the tools that property managers use can't do that. And so there's like a tech gap that's happening there. It's sort of like if a third of the machines can talk English and Airbnb and Booking.com will only talk with English-speaking ones, and the rest of them speak Latin, And so there's this gap that needs to translate the Latin into the English. So there's one reason why instant bookability hasn't happened is a tech problem.
Interesting. Well, let's go back to some of the big platforms, Booking.com and TripAdvisor specifically. Here we have some data points in terms of monthly visitors, and obviously eyes and traffic online is going to be key to putting those heads in beds. Jared, what do you think? I mean, Booking.com, Airbnb, what's next for the big online players here?
Sure. I mean, one thing that you're starting to see are the big OTAs. They're pushing more of alternative lodging into the traditional OTA model and into meta search. So the first step we saw, Expedia buy Home Away, and they've moved now. They're pushing instant bookability. They've increased the fee. They're making it more of like a true, for better or worse, depending on the user preference, but more of a corporate entity. So they've ramped up spending this year. They're spending a lot on technology, a lot on people, building the inventory. But what we expect to see happen is in the next couple of years, you're going to start seeing more of that type of inventory on Expedia.com. And because it's instant bookable, as that improves, you'll get more people who say are searching for lodging in New York City, and they'll not necessarily be looking for a specific hotel or Airbnb type property. It's just give me the best bang for my buck on a New York City rental for the weekend. And then for Booking.com, which is obviously the biggest hotel OTA and continues to dominate the space, they've pushed away from having Villas.com as a separate entity, and they're starting to push in that type of inventory on the Booking.com platform. And then obviously the meta search sites, which these guys own, they're operationally independent, but they're still housed within the OTAs, and they're kind of doing the same strategy where we've seen, Kayak and Trivago, both, it's been very early days, and we've spoken to management there, and they said it on earnings calls where they basically have said, if it gets enough interest in meta search for alternative lodgings, they will be there, which is interesting because we have, a company, say, which I think we'll talk about later, like a Tripping.com that specializes in meta search where right now they're the leader in the space, but if the space gets really attractive, all of a sudden you're going to have to compete with Trivago and Kayak and the pockets of Booking, pockets of Priceline and Expedia.
Right. Yeah. And this idea of first mover advantage, I think, is interesting. It seems like Airbnb is really just kind of killing it, right, in terms of what the attention that they're getting from the media and how they're doing it. Just from the outside looking in, it's kind of hard to understand how Priceline via Booking.com and other platforms or Expedia might ultimately compete with such a strong lifestyle brand that is Airbnb. But ultimately, a lot of that, once we get past that inventory question, boils down to eyes on the screen. And we just aside from these stats that we looked at in terms of monthly visitors in the millions, we actually looked at Booking.com, and they're up to close to 300 million visitors a month in terms of to their websites. And that doesn't include the app. That's just mobile web and desktop. So in terms of converting those, possibly that could be a competitive advantage for Booking and the Expedias is the traffic and that they get from cross-selling not only hotels and vacation rentals, but also airline and other products, which could also be perhaps a key to why Airbnb might be thinking about air, right, as a complement to that. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, final thoughts. But if we do look at the inventory in terms of professionally managed rentals, here's kind of the breakout, where we see some interesting stats coming from STR saying that Airbnb's total portfolio is about, in terms of professionally managed properties, about 1 million. That's about a third of all of their property inventory. You compare that to, let's say, the HomeAway family, which seems to have a better position in that market, TripAdvisor via FlipKey, and then Booking.com's slowly working into that space. But I think the big thing here is location of those properties, right? We talk about the urban rentals versus the traditional kind of, beach, golf, sun, mountain, ski resort type destinations is probably where the battle is kind of picking up right now, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also important to note too that I know we tend to have a lot more research and statistics on what's happening in the U.S. or in the Americas and Europe, but another big marketplace that we should also be paying attention to more closely in the coming years will be Asia,
right.
Specifically China too. So it'll be
Right.
interesting.
Definitely.
I think the one note on the chart is I think it understates Booking.com's involvement here. I would think by now it's probably more like 800,000 as we speak. It's neck and neck with FlipKey. And I think Wimdu just basically sold its assets to another company, Nine Flats. It's been sort of a bust as a company, and it's not doing well in the conversion. So again, we're moving from the phase, as I said, like from who has the most beds until who's good at converting, putting heads into those beds. And so that's where the HomeAway, Airbnb, and TripAdvisor may really pull away.
Yeah.
Right. Well, okay, so let's talk about the consolidation in the marketplace space of the vacation rental market, right? We have, obviously VRBO and HomeAway that picked up all those different brands across the globe. Basically, were kind of the first movers in consolidating all these different vacation rental properties. But now you have platforms like, Pillow and Vacasa that are also creating their own kind of consumer platforms, right? Probably more than anything, just to offset some of their distribution costs, right? Instead of working whatever traffic that they can pick up from their websites. My question is whether or not we're going to see more and more of these little micro or these property management sites that are creating their own kind of consumer platforms, where it's like a, death by 1,000 cuts, where you have like, all the, tiny little property management groups that are also going for that traffic, and whether they can realistically compete, obviously, is a question, but it's a weird market there, how that's shaping up, and how that potentially gets consolidated into these bigger brands, the VRBOs, the Vacasas, and who maybe even Wyndham as well, who've picked up a few property management groups of late. Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, with all that going on in terms of consolidation, yet fragmentation in the market, One question we have is around meta search and the vacation rental market. Is this really an opportunity for companies like Tripping.com?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say it's kind of an interesting dynamic where we spoke to Tripping, we did some research on it. It's definitely a pretty attractive business model. That's why you have decent funding, which I guess Sean could talk more about in terms of whether that's good or bad, and some of the things going on there. But from a business, they started putting in more comparable fees to, say, a HomeAway, which to me, that's one thing it's hard to reconcile, where they're charging 10 to 15% is what they told us, but then that's on top of the fee that the customer is paying. So I guess it makes sense if you're a small property manager and you want to try to compete with Airbnb, that you'll basically give away a large chunk of, say, your booking fee, and your hope is you win that customer, and the next time they book, they don't go to Tripping.com. So it's like an acquisition strategy. And then the big guys, an Airbnb who's not really on Tripping, or a HomeAway that is, but they're not going to give them very good economics. So, it's just an interesting thing where it remains to be seen if they can get enough people booking trips that way as opposed to just going to HomeAway or Airbnb. But it's definitely an interesting business model. I know Sean, he's talked before offline about some of the funding issues, if you want to talk about that.
Well, there's the other side of the equation is how do the property owners like it? Because property owners are used to like a classified listings model. They know what their budget is, and the meta model is sort of having to give a lot of little, a dime here, a dime there in a constant model, when they may not get a payback on it. And the owners are not as excited about that either. I think Tripping has raised so much money that they have golden handcuffs on, because now it's very hard for them to scale fast enough in a way to make their investors happy. There's, on the small side, there's companies like All the Rooms that are sort of nipping at their heels coming from below. And then to Deanna's point earlier, is this is the sense of hospitality, is there a need for a niche like this, or are we moving to a blur where condo hotels and timeshares and vacation rentals and short term and whole home and hotels are all going to be sort of blended together? So do you need, what's the value add? But
I'm a little bit more bullish on meta search in the vacation rental space. Whether or not Tripping.com is going to be the one that's going to make it happen is ultimately the big question. But if you think about all of the different marketplaces that are operating out there right now, very niche markets. I mean, luxury retreats, the acquisition of Airbnb, I think was a testament to the fact that there's still tons of inventory out there that is still up in the air. And how do you access that inventory? And Tripping has definitely laid the groundwork in terms of building those relationships with weird little off markets and property management groups like Canada Stays and Perfect Places and Love Home Swap, and all these little like players that are active in very niche markets. So how that's all going to get shaped up is I think is very, very, I think still to be debated. But obviously, it's going to be very difficult to compete with, the VRBOs and the Airbnbs of the world. So maybe Meta is going to be a way for that to happen for, like a Kayak, for example, or just to throw it out there.
Yeah, and I guess one other thing that, I don't know what the price would be if it would ever happen, but conceptually, I think you could see the same way the metas through the OTAs are rolling up traditional meta. You could buy a niche meta, same way Kayak now has Momondo House within it. Could Kayak conceivably say, okay, I'll own Tripping.com. It removes a competition. And also, it's just another way to generate traffic back to Expedia, through the same parent company. Or, there's a Booking.com, there's a Priceline.com, do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, we did the big meta search report, and one thing that we realized is that there's the easy way to do meta search and then the hard way to do the meta search. The easy way is kind of through the GDSs, well, at least for the air in hotels, where you just plug and play through the GDSs, but building those partnerships at the ground level particularly for such a fragmented market. That vacation rental space is, I think, going to be very tricky from a technology perspective. I know there's one company, Red Awning, that's been doing quite a bit in that space. Sean covers that company quite clearly. Sean, what do you think? What's the take there? I mean, there's so many different platforms out there, right?
Yeah, there are. HomeAway is one of the giants here as a platform marketplace, and they have their own sort of basic B2B services that they offer to help property managers. But some property managers want more sophisticated tools. And also, the HomeAway wants to get some of that fractured market that we've referred to before that are using sort of old, antiquated tools, and to try to HomeAway has not really made an effort, neither has Booking.com or the others, to try to build tech there. So there's a layer of middleware that's coming up, startups like Red Awning that are trying to sort of help be go-betweens between the two. So it helps with technology and helping property managers do demand management to decide, up until now, a lot of property managers, they just set and forget it. Once a year, they say, this is going to be our peak season rate. This is going to be our off-season rate. And now you could customize it based on, what demand is in Tahoe or in Florence at any particular time. So Red Awning is one of the interesting players there that has made some progress technologically in order to help the property managers there. But there's others as well.
And the HomeAway platforms, it's the V12.net and the Escapia platforms, right?
Yes, both of those, yes.
Has anybody heard of, just in terms of satisfaction rates among vacation rental, the property managers, and how those platforms are shaping up? A lot of them are using them, I know that, but
yeah, a lot of them are using them. Since Expedia Inc. took them over, they haven't been breaking out a lot of that information as much. But before that, it was only a small percentage, maybe under 10% of all the property management companies and small independent players that were using them. So it was still a niche growing business.
Gotcha. And Dave, I know that you looked a lot into just kind of sussing out the differences between some of these property management groups. And, we looked at Wyndham and Vacasa in particular, kind of this roll-up that's happening among the property management groups now. What's your take on what's happening with Vacasa in particular?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting how they're trying to expand, of course. I mean, Vacasa has been raising a lot of capital and has been kind of deploying that by acquiring smaller companies to grow their inventory. And, Vacasa has the interesting take, as you mentioned earlier, that trying to push through a proprietary platform as well to kind of curtail that distribution cost. And, it's a really interesting approach. I think sometimes it gets mislabeled as the industry growing, where it's actually more of the ownership of those properties changing hands. But Vacasa has been growing pretty quickly, and I think it seems as if it's working out for them. Do
you get a sense of how big some of these little, these, I don't want to say little, but like these acquisitions? I mean, it seems like just one or two a month, even three a month, they're going around and picking up Arrow Point Vacation Rentals, Miavac, and just kind of absorbing them into their inventory. Are these like 10, 15 property players? Is it 50? Did you get a sense of that at all?
Absolutely. I think that the majority are between over 20, around 20 to like 40. But I've seen they've done some larger acquisitions as well. I don't recall the names right now, but they have done stuff around just under 100 as well. So the size really varies, but over 100, you'd really be considered a large property management company in the industry.
Right. One thing that I found interesting was, clearly Wyndham in terms of worldwide. It looks like the destination network actually is a larger chunk of the revenue for Wyndham worldwide compared to the hotels group.
Yeah, I mean, Wyndham, it's really interesting. Their destination network, it's made up of shares. What is the name? Can't recall right now.
Timeshares?
Talking about timeshares?
Exactly, timeshares, yeah. I've never been to one. That's why I was...
it's a U.S. thing, I guess.
It's a US thing, maybe, yeah. So that portion is made up of the timeshares and vacation rentals. But again, Wyndham as well, they've been growing through acquisition mostly. They've been acquiring a lot over here in Europe as well. It's been a growing market for them. And the majority of their income comes through their property development, actually. So their vacation ownership, which is interesting as well. And by getting back to vacation rentals, they're trying as well to maximize their direct distribution, so their proprietary distribution, which I think is a big topic. It's like the direct booking wars in hotels, pretty much. And one of the most recent companies they've acquired, in fact, is Wimdu here in Germany to kind of power on that proprietary distribution.
Sean, did you say that Wimdu is not doing all that great?
I'm sorry. I got that wrong. I got Wimdu confused with another company.
Oh, it's okay. Okay.
But Wimdu did merge with 9 Flats.
When that happened, Wimdu, as it was described by the acquirer at 9 Flats, was that it was not doing that well. But I didn't know about the Wyndham arrangement.
Interesting.
Yeah, it just happened recently. I think the deal was cleared earlier this year.
What was the recent UK urban rental platform that they acquired? Wasn't there something?
From Wyndham?
Like crazy.
Well, last year they purchased Blue Chip Holidays and Friendly Rentals, DayZ, which are all European-based vacation rentals.
Gotcha. So, Dave, what else is going on in the kind of the funding component of vacation rentals, across the context of these three kind of groups, marketplaces, property management tech, and the property management groups themselves?
Yeah, well, there's a lot has been going on. Like traditionally, most of the funding has always gone towards the online marketplaces. Of course, Airbnb and its Chinese counterparts taking up all the funding. But if you kind of exclude those big online marketplaces, you get around, I think it was roughly 120 million funding last year, which was spread between property management companies like Vacasa, which raised quite a substantial amount. And MetaSearch has been a big year last year as well, which they've kind of built up on the large funding they had in 2015. So it seems to be like a really trending industry. But what I find really interesting is, for instance, in Europe, Accor Hotel has been kind of playing into vacation rental. So when you look at where the capital is coming from in investments, traditionally in Europe, M&A isn't really a big practice, And since Sébastien Bazin took over, the new CEO of Accor, they're moving to an asset-light strategy. So these like big hotel chains are sitting on mountains of cash, and they're just looking to deploy it, And One Fine Stay, I think, was a really interesting acquisition from them, 168 million, I think, something around that, for a business that's losing a substantial amount of money. Obviously, it's a long-term investment, but I think as an asset-light hotel, the strategies aren't that different either. They don't own the property. They're literally just putting their brand on it and renting it. So I think that was really interesting. And they're also actively investing. So Accor has invested in Square Break and Oasis Collection. And I'm not sure, I think Diana wrote something about this. I think they're in the phase of acquiring Travel Keys.
Yep.
Yeah, so, it's interesting to see like a hotel move in the vacation rental space. But as I said, I think meta search is as well a big thing. As we said before, searching for a vacation rental is still kind of, right. It's not a challenge, but I think there's still stuff that can be done on the distribution and search part of it. And what we've seen also is Sonder, for instance, they raised $10 million, and they're also following kind of the One Fine Stay model, where it's more of a curated vacation rentals, and it seems as if they're kind of trying to build a brand around it. So, following this overall curation brand in travel, where you have a selection of listings rather than everything, and I think that's an interesting approach. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if other hotels follow a core strategy. They have the cash, they've sold their brick and mortar buildings, and I think there's a lot to come still.
That's really interesting. I I think I remember one of the first Airbnbs I stayed at was in Rio de Janeiro. And that's a really interesting market from a hotelier perspective, just because the inventory is horrible from the hotel side. So Airbnb is just killing it over there, and it really brings a lot of value add to the user and to the traveler, particularly in markets like Rio. And I just remembered that, like, wow, this is like my first experience. And I was like, wow, well, what are the hotel groups are gonna do? And just thinking to myself, they better start buying up, individual properties. And it seems like that's what's happening right now.
I would just echo. I was in Rio for the Olympics in the summer, and I stayed at Airbnb, and it's the same, like as an experience. Deanna, do you think that hotel groups want to get into the space of actually sort of managing and providing the services? In London, like, there's the Bermondsey Hotel is doing an experiment where they're offering the housekeeping to vacation rental properties within like a mile or two of the hotel.
Right. That was similar to this
Theming,
pilot
right?
that Hyatt did with One Fine Stay before One Fine Stay got bought by Accor. Whoops. But yeah, and there were rumors that Hyatt was possibly trying to buy it as well. So I think that they definitely have this in their plans, but I haven't really seen anyone kind of, unlike except for Accor, really like pull the trigger and go for it. But I think it would be very smart for them to do that. I think some are also kind of taking like baby steps toward that. Not really going full on into vacation rental, but trying to sort of like look at the brands and properties that they have now and try to see what they can do with those properties to really sort of appeal to the types of travelers who would want to book a vacation rental. So I know like earlier this year, Marriott announced that with their newly added Element brand, which is sort of like extended stay, they wanted to try to like build certain rooms that were really flexible for very large groups. So that it's like dorm style. So you still have like your kind of traditional extended stay room, but slightly smaller and attached to like a big living space. So it's like, still a part of a hotel, but kind of trying to replicate some of the things that you'd find in a vacation rental.
Yeah, and I think, obviously it was very smart for Airbnb to go after that DIY market as kind of a inventory generating strategy. And now that they own that market, now they're moving into that professional space. I think that with that transition, I think there's been quite a bit of, I don't want to say confusion, but at least some just a lack of understanding in terms of who actually stays at Airbnbs these days. Is it, kind of the sharing economy, quintessential sharing economy hipster or millennial, smoking cigarettes, burning, holes into your couches, throwing college parties? Or is it, the responsible couple, adventure, the golden age traveler that's kind of, wants to experience a new thing when it comes to accommodations? This is one of the questions that we asked for our big 2017 high income traveler survey, where we surveyed 1,375 U.S. travelers, all earning 100,000 U.S. plus, asking about their travel habits, and we asked about their opinions and their behavior around Airbnb specifically. And in terms of incidents, what we see was that 23% of those respondents actually said that they've stayed at an Airbnb at least one time, with another 13% saying that they used Airbnb numerous times. So in terms of incidence rate, we're getting up to the 30s and 40 percentile, where from a traveler perspective, these are all 100K plus travelers, where obviously the brand recognition is getting very important, very interesting for that company. When we asked whether or not people would actually consider staying at an Airbnb apartment while traveling, we see this interesting curve here where we have a strong, definitely for 30 close to a third of the respondents saying that they definitely stay at an Airbnb, over a third saying maybe, and then you have a certain amount of those high-income travelers basically saying that they're either probably not going to go, definitely not going to go, or not even sure what Airbnb is. Here, I would just point out that 5% only said, "What is Airbnb?" So clearly, it's a national phenomenon. Everybody knows the platform by now. No longer a niche market. I would also add that satisfaction rates with the Airbnb experience are also quite high, and I think that the company also echo that, and other sources would see that. But over 90% satisfaction rate, where 60% said they were very satisfied, is a very compelling piece of the puzzle. In terms of preference from the Airbnb experience versus the traditional hotel experience, and this question came to those that had actually stayed in Airbnb before. We see that over a quarter, or over close to 3/4 of the respondents said they actually preferred the Airbnb experience over the traditional hotel experience. And that's just capturing a moment in time for that person. So maybe they just gotten home from an Airbnb vacation, but nevertheless, it's those are some pretty high numbers there. And then when we look at just the overall share in terms of the age distribution across the Airbnb user, we see that those that have actually stayed at an Airbnb tend to trend younger, but it's not necessarily the 18 to 25-year-olds that you might expect, where you still see a good portion of those that are traveling in the older demographics, or more mature demographics, I should say. All right, great. Well, thanks so much, everybody. And this is just kind of the final thoughts here. I'm just going to do a little go around the board and get any final thoughts from our participants. Dave from Berlin, you want to say anything to wrap up the show?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great period for vacation rentals. They're sorting out the whole infrastructure. It's interesting because obviously this whole movement into tech for them is quite interesting to see how it plays out. But I think it's ultimately it'll end up like in the hotels, HomeAway and Booking.com will own all the distribution, and in 5 years' time, we'll be talking about the direct booking wars between vacation rentals and the OTAs.
Oh, wow. Okay. Sean?
I'm interested in the B2B vendor front. Like, the hotel industry has Oracle, Micros, it has Disco, it has these players that have built up channel managers and switches. And as professionally managed properties become more common, as Airbnb switches from sort of an eBay style to something that's more like Amazon today, where it's a lot of professional retailers using it, where are these big software company players going to get in there and provide the tech? So I'll be interested in seeing that.
Interesting. Deanna?
I'm glad I could participate in the chat today. Learned a lot. I think the biggest takeaway for me is really that there's so much opportunity in this space, and we're definitely going to hear a lot more news about it in the coming months and years.
Definitely looking forward to the coverage. Jared?
Yeah, I mean, it's been great doing this, and I guess one thing I would I agree with Dave that the OTAs are going to start being really important for the alternative lodging. I guess one thing I would just disagree on is the direct booking wars, because if they become important, the OTAs are going to own them. So you wouldn't really be battling against yourself if you're owning HomeAway. I mean, maybe the smaller channels, but I don't think the smaller channels will have enough clout to have a true direct booking advertising campaign against Booking.com and Expedia. But that's just my thought.
Well, maybe let's see if Chesky and team, as they do their world tour right now, and come up with some good ways to give some of those OTAs a run for their money around flights and other innovations coming from that team. We're all wondering what's going to happen in that front. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much for coming onto the show, and we look forward to next time.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.